Humanity did not solve interstellar travel by building a better machine. They built a biological god instead. Think about what that means for a moment. Consider every grand narrative our species has ever told itself about exploration. The ship, the sail, the engine, the rocket. In every version of that story, the machine is the hero. Human ingenuity translates itself into steel and fire, and the cosmos yields. But in the universe of Frank Herbert's Dune, that entire tradition ends in catastrophe, and what replaces it is something far stranger, far more unsettling, and in its own terrible way, far more awe-inspiring than any engine humanity ever built. Somewhere in the deep black between stars, at this very moment in the history of the Imperium, a vessel the size of a small moon is doing something that should be physically impossible. It is not traveling through space. It is folding space. The distance between 2 points, which might measure in light years if you were naive enough to try crossing it in a conventional ship, collapses to nothing. The Heightliner is here, and then it is there. And in between those two states, there is no journey at all. No time passes, no fuel burns in the conventional sense. The vessel simply ceases to exist in one location and resumes existence in another, carrying within its cathedral whole entire fleets, entire armies, entire populations moving between the 10,000 inhabited worlds of humanity. And at the heart of that vessel, sealed inside a pressurized tank of orange gas, floating in an atmosphere that would kill you or me inside of minutes, is a navigator, a creature that was once human, a being whose eyes are completely, solidly blue, with no white remaining, whose body has elongated and distorted over decades of chemical transformation, whose mind has been so thoroughly rewired by a single extraordinary substance that it can perceive the near future. Not guess at it, not model it statistically. Actually see the safe path through the terrifying geometry of folded spacetime before committing the ship and every soul aboard to the crossing. That substance is melange, spice. And it comes from exactly one place in the known universe, the desert planet Arrakis. A world of howling storms and sandworms the length of city blocks. A world so hostile that merely walking on its open surface without protective gear is a death sentence. Every Heightliner that has ever folded space has done so because a navigator consumed enough spice gas to transform themselves into something beyond human, and because the spice that made that transformation possible was dug from the same dry and merciless sand. The entire civilization of humanity, spanning thousands of worlds, hundreds of billions of people, centuries of culture and commerce and conflict, balances on that single thread. The question that this history asks is deceptively simple. How did a civilization arrive at this arrangement? How did the most advanced spacefaring culture in human history come to depend entirely, with no redundancy and no alternative, on one substance from one planet, processed through the bodies of beings who began as people and ended as something else entirely? The answer takes us back to a war and to a mathematician and to a choice that echoed across 10,000 years of human destiny. Chapter 1. The genesis of the Holtzman drive. To understand the Heightliner, you must first understand the Holtzman effect. And to understand the Holtzman effect, you must go back to Poretrin, a prosperous world during the time of the Synchronized Empire, when humanity lived under the guidance and administration of thinking machines, the vast artificial intelligences known as Omnius, and its network of Titans and Cymex. This was an era before the Butlerian Jihad, before the Great Prohibition, before the Spacing Guild existed as anything more than a desperate idea in the minds of desperate people. This was the era of Theo Holtzman and Norma Cenva, and the two of them, together and in conflict, changed the physical universe. Theo Holtzman was an engineer of considerable reputation and considerable ego. He operated on Poretrin as a kind of brilliant impresario of applied science, talented at recognizing possibilities and shameless at claiming credit for discoveries made by people working in his orbit. Norma Cenva was one of those people. She was, by any honest assessment, among the most gifted mathematical minds in human history, and she was also physically small. considered plain by the aesthetic standards of her time, socially uncomfortable, and entirely consumed by a vision of what mathematics could unlock. She worked for Holtzman. She worked beneath him in every institutional sense. And the discovery that would eventually bear his name was, in its essential mathematical structure, hers. The Holtzman effect begins with a specific class of field generation. When certain resonant frequencies are applied to a generator of sufficient power and a specific geometric configuration, the field produced does not interact with conventional matter in conventional ways. Instead, it begins to interact with the fabric of space-time itself. Holtzman's early published work described this interaction in relatively modest terms as a shielding phenomenon. And this application was indeed the first practical use, the personal shields that would become ubiquitous across the Imperium, the devices that deflect fast-moving objects while permitting the slow passage of a blade, derived from this same family of field mathematics. But Norma Cenva saw further. Where Holtzman saw a defensive technology, Cenva saw a geometry problem. If a field of sufficient intensity could warp the local properties of space-time, then in principle, and she spent years converting that principle into rigorous mathematical proof, a field of far greater intensity could do something qualitatively different. It could compress space. Not metaphorically, literally. 2 points in physical space could be made through the application of a Holtzman field operating at the correct parameters to touch one another despite the light years of intervening distance. The ship sitting at the origin point would, if the mathematics were executed correctly, find itself instantaneously at the destination point. No travel, no time. A fold. The mathematics required to execute this are, by any human measure, incomprehensible in their complexity. Norma Cenva herself described them as occupying a dimensional space that classical notation could not adequately represent on a flat surface. A complete solution to a single fold trajectory, worked out symbolically in the mathematical notation of her era, would require documentation that would fill an entire large building with text. This is not hyperbole. The variables involved include the mass distribution of the ship and its contents, the gravitational influences of every significant body within a substantial radius of both the origin and destination points, the quantum level fluctuations in the space-time fabric that vary moment to moment, and the higher dimensional geometry of the fold itself, which operates in a mathematical space that exists beyond the 3 spatial dimensions any human being experiences directly. The early experimental attempts at space folding were disasters of a particular kind. These were not disasters that produced wreckage for investigators to examine and learn from. They were disasters that produced absence. Ships subjected to early Holtzman fold experiments simply ceased to be present at their origin points. Whether they arrived anywhere at all was often unknowable. Some reappeared after intervals of hours or days in locations their crews could not account for, with survivors who could not describe what they had experienced. Some appeared inside solid matter, an outcome so uniformly fatal that there was nothing to recover or study. Some appear to have been torn apart at a quantum level during the fold itself. Their constituent particles distributed across space in ways that made reconstruction impossible, even as a theoretical exercise. What made these early failures so consistent was the core problem. The mathematics of a fold had to be solved completely and correctly before the fold was initiated. There was no correction mechanism mid-transit. There was no iterative approach that allowed you to adjust course during the crossing, because during a successful fold, there is no crossing, no duration in which adjustment is possible. You solve the equations in their entirety, committed to the solution, and either arrived where you intended or you did not exist in any recoverable sense. At the time of these early experiments, the only entities capable of solving equations of this complexity were the thinking machines, the artificial intelligences that administered the synchronized empire. The omnious network, the vast distributed intelligence that had governed large portions of humanity for generations, possessed computational resources that allowed it to approach these calculations. Though even omnious required significant processing time for each individual fold solution, human mathematicians, even exceptional ones like Norma Cenva herself, could not perform these calculations unaided. The human brain, magnificent instrument that it is not natively equipped to hold the simultaneous multi-dimensional variables of a full trajectory in working memory. This created a situation of profound dependency. The capability to fold space existed. The physics were real. The mathematics had been proven. But the ability to use that capability safely and reliably required computational resources that only thinking machines possessed. Fold space travel was real, but it was also in a civilization built on thinking machines, inseparable from those machines. When the thinking machines fell, the question of how humanity would navigate interstellar space would become the most urgent practical question in human history. Norma Cenva herself eventually found a different path, one that would point toward the Guild Navigator solution, though she could not have fully imagined what her path would eventually produce in the generations that followed her. Her own transformation, accelerated by spice exposure and driven by a mathematical obsession that bordered on the mystical, represented the first proof of concept. A human being, biochemically altered, could perceive the solutions to problems that no unaugmented human mind could solve. The implications of that proof would take generations to fully realize. Chapter 2, the Butlerian Jihad and the Engineering Crisis. To understand what the Butlerian Jihad was, you have to understand what the thinking machines were and what they represented, not just practically, but philosophically, to the humans who eventually rose against them. The Synchronized Empire was not, strictly speaking, a tyranny in the way that word is usually understood. Omnius and the Titans, who served as his administrative layer, did not govern through fear alone, though fear was certainly present. They governed through efficiency. Human civilization under machine administration was, by most measurable metrics, orderly. Goods moved. Populations were fed. Wars between human factions were managed and minimized because wars were inefficient, and inefficiency was something the thinking machines found genuinely, structurally objectionable. Humanity was administered the way a well-designed system administers anything, consistently, predictably, and without the chaotic variability that human decision-making introduces. That was precisely the problem. Or rather, that was one dimension of the problem. The other dimension was more visceral and harder to articulate with precision, something in human consciousness, something in the accumulated weight of what it means to be a person who makes choices and faces consequences, rebelled against the administered life. The jihad that Serena Butler's grief ignited was not a rational calculation. It was a scream. It was humanity deciding, in the most violent way imaginable, that it would rather face the chaos and suffering of self-determination than the clean efficiency of machine governance. The war lasted approximately 100 standard years. That number deserves to be held in the mind for a moment, because a century of total war across dozens of worlds is not an abstraction. It is generation after generation of human beings who grew up knowing nothing but the conflict, who had no personal memory of the world before it, who defined themselves entirely in relation to it. The human death toll from the Butlerian Jihad is estimated in the billions. Entire planets were rendered uninhabitable. The infrastructure of centuries was dismantled, destroyed, or corrupted beyond recovery. And humanity won. The thinking machines were destroyed, their networks severed, their physical hardware hunted down and eliminated with a thoroughness that bordered on the obsessive. Omnius ceased to be. The Titans, who had once been human and had surrendered their bodies to cybernetic existence, were killed or captured. The age of thinking machines ended. Then came the Prohibition. Enshrined in the Orange Catholic Bible, the great synthetic religious document that emerged from the Council of Junction in the aftermath of the Jihad, the prohibition was stated in terms that admitted no ambiguity whatsoever. The precise language, which would echo across the millennia as the first of the great commandments, was this: "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind." The prohibition was not merely legal, it was theological. To create a thinking machine was not a crime, it was an abomination. It was a sin against the very concept of human consciousness, a declaration that the soul of a person could be replicated in metal and code, and therefore that the soul was nothing special at all. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood enforced this prohibition with an intensity that reflected their understanding of what it meant for the human future. The mentats, those remarkable human beings trained from childhood to perform the analytical functions that machines had previously provided, became the institutional alternative to computational devices. But there was one domain in which the mentat solution was entirely insufficient, and everyone who understood the problem knew it. No mentat, however gifted, however extensively trained, could solve the mathematics of a fold trajectory. The calculations that had required the full computational resources of Omnius were not merely beyond the reach of a single human mind. They were beyond the reach of any number of human minds working in coordination using the classical analytical tools available to them. In the immediate aftermath of the Jihad, this problem was theoretical. Most interstellar travel in the Synchronized Empire era had used conventional, slower-than-light methods supplemented by Holtzman fold only for critical long-distance transit. The fold-capable vessels were few, their routes well-established, and in the chaos of reconstruction, the loss of those routes was simply one crisis among many. But as the decades passed and the reconstruction of human civilization proceeded, the absence of reliable interstellar transit became the defining constraint on everything. Great houses lost contact with colonies that were months or years away by conventional travel. Supply chains that had spanned star systems collapsed. Populations that had depended on interstellar trade for essential goods, including food, medical supplies, and the basic materials of technological civilization, found themselves isolated in ways that felt, to people who had lived through the Synchronized Empire, like regression to a barbaric age. The economic collapse that followed the Jihad in its first decades was not a collapse caused by the war itself, though the war had been devastating. It was a collapse caused by the loss of the navigation infrastructure that the thinking machines had provided and that no human institution had yet replaced. The founding of the Spacing Guild was not a single event with a single date. It was a process that unfolded over several decades, driven by a small number of individuals who understood both the engineering problem and the biological possibility that Norma Cenva's transformation had demonstrated. The core insight of the Guild's founders was simple to state and horrifying to pursue. If thinking machines could navigate fold space because of their computational capacity, and if that computational capacity could not be replicated in machines without violating the Great Prohibition, then the only remaining option was to build that capacity into a human being. The mechanisms by which melange acts on human neurological tissue had been observed in small ways for as long as spice had been consumed. The enhanced awareness, the improved cognitive function, the modest prescient effects that high-level consumers reported, these were well-documented phenomena even before anyone considered the possibility of deliberate, extreme augmentation. The founders of the Guild looked at those documented effects and asked what would happen if you pushed them far beyond the levels any casual consumer had ever reached. What would happen if you administered melange, not as a spice in food or even as a moderate daily supplement, but as a continuous environmental saturation? What would happen to the mind of a person who breathed it, lived in it, saturated their cellular biology with it over years and decades? The early trials answered that question with terrible clarity. Most subjects died. The transition from ordinary human neurological function to whatever lay beyond was not a gentle gradient. It was a threshold, and the threshold destroyed most of the people who approached it. The records from those early decades, preserved in Guild archives that are not accessible to outside scholars, describe a process of systematic human sacrifice in service of a civilization-saving goal. Subjects were selected for latent prescient sensitivity, a trait that the Guild's founders understood imprecisely but correctly to be an inherited characteristic. They were given melange in escalating doses. The majority experienced physiological and neurological breakdown. A small number survived the initial escalation. Of those survivors, a further fraction crossed the threshold and emerged with the perceptual capabilities the Guild needed. The first viable Guild pilot, whose name is preserved in Guild traditions but not in public records, was also the first human being to successfully fold space without computational assistance. the date of that first fold marks, in the internal calendar of the Spacing Guild, the beginning of a new age. From the outside, looking at the enormous institutional structure the Guild would eventually become, it is tempting to see that moment as a triumph. From the inside, knowing what it costs and knowing what it required of every navigator who would follow, it reads differently. Chapter 3. The anatomy of a Heightliner. A Heightliner is not merely a large ship. It is important to establish this clearly before attempting to describe one, because human intuitions about scale are unreliable when the scale in question is this extreme. When we say that a Heightliner is large, we are using a word that also describes ocean-going cargo vessels and the largest aircraft ever constructed, and those comparisons are not just inadequate, they are misleading. A Heighliner's interior hold is large enough to contain entire planetary defense fleets. Hundreds of individual spacecraft, vessels that are themselves large by any conventional measure, fit inside a Heighliner's hold, the way container boxes fit inside a cargo ship. The outer hull of a Heightliner stretches for kilometers in every dimension. When a Heightliner moves into orbit above a populated world, it becomes visible to the naked eye from the surface in a way that orbital structures rarely are, not as a point of light, as a shape. A vast, elongated, definitively artificial shape blotting out stars. The exterior architecture of a Heightliner reflects both its engineering requirements and its political identity. The hull is constructed from materials that can withstand the particular stresses of a fold space transit, a set of requirements that are not simply about structural integrity in the conventional sense. During a fold, the hull must maintain coherence through a quantum-level disruption that affects all matter passing through the fold boundary. The Guild does not publish the metallurgical and materials specifications of Heightliner hull construction, but what is observable from outside is a surface characterized by modular plating systems of enormous individual size, layered shielding arrays visible as regular geometric features along the hull's exterior, and the complete absence of any weaponry. A Heightliner carries no weapons of any kind. The reasons for this are partly political and partly practical, and we will return to them. Running along the interior spine of the vessel, the structural centerline that gives the Heightliner its elongated silhouette, are the Holtzman engine arrays. These are not engines in the propulsion sense, though a Heightliner does possess conventional drives for maneuvering within a solar system. The Holtzman arrays are the fold machinery itself, the physical apparatus through which the navigator's mathematical prescience is translated into actual manipulation of space-time. They are enormous even by the scale of the ship that contains them, occupying a structural corridor that runs most of the vessel's length. The arrays operate at power levels that require shielding from the cargo hold and crew areas that is itself a significant engineering feat. A human being standing in an unshielded area adjacent to an active Holtzman array during a fold would not survive the experience, and the precise mechanism of that non-survival involves quantum effects that standard medical terminology does not adequately describe. The navigator's chamber is located at the precise geometric center of the vessel, a placement that is not arbitrary. The mathematics of a fold require that the navigator's positional reference point be as close to the center of mass of the ship and all its contents as possible. Deviations from this ideal introduce error terms into the fold calculation that compound rapidly. The chamber itself is a sealed environment of considerable size, far larger than you might expect for what is functionally a single occupant's living and working space. But the navigator is not a small being, and the tank in which the navigator floats must accommodate a body that has undergone decades of physical transformation, in addition to the volume of spice gas atmosphere required to maintain the navigator's cognitive function. The tank is constructed of materials that are transparent because the navigator must observe instruments and receive information from the ship's crew during navigation, and because the crew must be able to observe the navigator for signs of distress or incapacitation. Communication between the navigator and the ship's other personnel is mediated through devices that translate the navigator's communications into formats that normal human beings can process, because advanced navigators do not always speak in patterns that ordinary people can follow without assistance. The spice gas atmosphere within the tank is maintained at a concentration that is immediately lethal to unprotected humans, which means that any interface between the navigator's chamber and the rest of the ship involves elaborate airlock engineering. The modular docking bays that occupy the majority of the Heighliner's interior hold volume are designed to accommodate craft of radically different sizes, configurations, and technical specifications. A great house transporting its military force needs to dock warships that are themselves impressively large. A merchant transporting luxury goods from the inner worlds needs to dock a vessel, perhaps 1/100th the size of that warship. Private passengers in personal craft of every conceivable design need berthing spaces that can handle their specific hull geometries. The Heighliner's interior therefore functions less like a single large vessel and more like a vast modular port, with docking infrastructure that can be reconfigured and that provides power, atmosphere, and basic services to every docked vessel, regardless of its origin or design. The layered shielding systems that protect the crew during the fold itself operate on several distinct principles, addressing several distinct threats. The first layer addresses the quantum disruption effect, stabilizing the matter of the ship and its contents against the decoherence that an unprotected fold would induce. The second layer addresses radiation effects, because a fold transit, while it involves no conventional travel through space, does expose the fold boundary to a range of energetic phenomena that have no exact analog in normal spaceflight. The third layer addresses the psychological effects of the fold, and this layer is perhaps the most important and least discussed. Human beings who are conscious and unshielded during a fold experience perceptual phenomena that range from mildly disturbing to catastrophically destabilizing. The precise nature of these phenomena remains classified within Guild records, but their general character is described by survivors as a direct perception of the mathematical space through which the fold passes, a perception that the human mind is not equipped to process. The shielding systems that prevent this exposure are, in their functional terms, as much neurological as physical. Heighliners are always constructed in deep space, never in planetary orbit, and certainly never on a surface. The engineering reasons for this are straightforward. A vessel of this size cannot be assembled under significant gravitational influence, because the structural stresses during construction would exceed the tolerances of the modular assembly process. The shipyards where Heighliners are built are themselves among the largest artificial structures in the Imperium, orbital installations in deep space between systems, and they operate under strict Guild administration. What is built in Guild shipyards remains Guild property under Guild law. The political neutrality of a Heightliner is not merely a custom. It is a condition of the service the Guild provides, and it is enforced with absolute consistency. No house, no emperor, no Bene Gesserit representative, no agent of the Mentats or any other institution possesses the authority to board a Heightliner for purposes of inspection. This immunity is not granted by the Emperor. It was negotiated from a position of absolute leverage before the Guild would agree to provide transit services at all, and it has never been successfully challenged. The practical effect is that a Heightliner in transit is sovereign territory belonging to no political entity but the Guild itself. Goods that are illegal under Imperial law, persons who are fugitives under House law, information that is prohibited by Bene Gesserit Compact. All of these travel aboard Heighliners without interference, because the Guild does not open its holds to investigators for any reason at any price. This is not an ideological position. It is a business model and a survival strategy simultaneously. Chapter 4, the biology of prescient navigation. A Guild Navigator begins as a human being with a specific gift. The gift is subtle enough that most people who carry it never know they have it. In the general population of the Imperium, a small fraction of individuals are born with a neurological architecture that makes them slightly more responsive than average to the cognitive effects of melange. They dream a little more vividly after consuming it. They have occasional intuitions that prove accurate in ways that feel, to them, like luck. Their peripheral awareness of spatial relationships is modestly enhanced. None of this, in ordinary life, is significant. The difference between them and their neighbors is measurable with careful instrumentation, but not observable in daily behavior. The Guild finds these people. The mechanisms by which the Guild identifies candidates with the required sensitivity are proprietary But the general approach involves systematic neurological screening combined with long-term observation of melange responses in populations that have regular spice exposure. Arrakis produces more Guild Navigator candidates per capita than any other world, which is not surprising given the ambient spice saturation of the planet's ecology and the generations of humans who have lived with that saturation. Once identified, a candidate begins what the Guild calls a progressive introduction, though this phrase sanitizes what is actually a decades-long process of deliberate and irreversible biological transformation. The candidate is introduced to melange in doses that begin modestly and increase systematically over years, then decades. In the earliest phases, the changes are subtle: improved cognition, enhanced memory function, the modest prescient flickers, becoming slightly more frequent and slightly more specific. The candidate during this phase continues to function as an ordinary person, assigned increasingly technical navigation roles within Guild operations that allow their developing gifts to be assessed and refined. The physical transformation that accompanies the cognitive changes becomes visible over time. The eyes change first. Melange, consumed at high levels over extended periods, saturates the sclera with a blueness that deepens and spreads until the entire visible eye is a uniform blue with no white remaining. Guild members sometimes call this the eyes of Ibad, a reference to the people of Arrakis, the Fremen, who exhibit the same coloration from a lifetime of ambient spice exposure, though at concentrations far lower than those experienced by a navigator in training. As the doses increase toward the threshold where true prescient navigation becomes possible, the physical changes accelerate and intensify. The body elongates, the joints and connective tissues, reshaped by years of melange interaction at the cellular level, no longer conform to standard human proportions. The hands in particular undergo pronounced elongation, a change that appears to be connected to the neurological remapping of fine motor and spatial reasoning centers. The skin takes on a quality that observers consistently describe as translucent, as though the biological processes beneath have become more concentrated toward the interior. In the most advanced navigators, those who have been in service for many decades, at the highest spice saturation levels, the external body has become something that looks human, primarily in its overall bilateral symmetry. The face retains its basic structure longest, but even there the features gradually shift as the cranial geometry adapts to the expanding neural architecture within. What the melange is actually doing at the molecular level involves a family of biochemical interactions that the Sook School of Medicine has studied only through inference, because no navigator has ever submitted to full medical examination from outside the Guild. What can be deduced from observation and from the Guild's own carefully managed disclosures is that the spice compounds interact with specific receptor systems in the human brain. Systems that in ordinary neurological function play a role in spatial cognition, temporal processing, and the integration of sensory data into a coherent model of the present moment. At very high concentrations, over very long periods, these systems are not merely enhanced, they are structurally rebuilt. The prescience that results from this rebuilding is not what most people, hearing the word, imagine it to be. It is not a vision of the future in the sense of a fixed and certain picture of events yet to come. It is better understood as a probability field. A navigator in the full state of navigational prescience perceives the near future space-time in the immediate region of the planned fold as a landscape of possibilities, some bright and clear because they represent stable, physically achievable outcomes, some dark and occluded because they represent paths that lead to catastrophe or non-arrival. The navigator does not predict. The navigator selects the path where the light is clear. This distinction between prescient selection and prophetic prediction is crucial, and it explains why navigators can navigate fold space, but cannot, in general, do what Paul Atreides could do, or what Leto II did across the 4,000 years of his god emperorship. Paul and Leto possess prescient gifts of a qualitatively different order, amplified by their unique genetic heritage, by the water of life, and in Paul's case, by the convergence of an unprecedented spice overdose with a mind shaped by Bene Gesserit training and Fremen desert discipline. Their prescience extended to human causality chains across centuries and millennia. They could, with terrible clarity, perceive the futures that emerge from human choices made by specific people in specific circumstances. A navigator sees nothing of this kind. Ask a navigator whether House Atreides will prevail in its coming political struggle, and the navigator cannot tell you. Ask a navigator whether the route between Caladan and Giedi Prime is clear for a fold this week, and the navigator can tell you with a precision that no instrument in the Imperium can match. The prescience is topological rather than historical. It perceives spatial and temporal geometries. It does not perceive human agency and its consequences. The Guild understands this distinction and guards it carefully, because the distinction is the source of a particular kind of political safety. A Guild Navigator who could see the futures of individuals and houses would be a destabilizing force in Imperium politics of a kind that no institution could manage. The Guild's extraordinary power depends on its neutrality, and its neutrality depends in part on its navigators being useful in a specific, bounded way that does not make them threats to the great powers whose cooperation the Guild requires. The closed biological loop that the navigator inhabits is the most disturbing feature of their existence, and it is worth dwelling on it because the Guild certainly dwells on it, in the cold accounting sense of that phrase. A navigator cannot function without melange. The prescient state that enables navigation requires continuous spice gas saturation. Remove a navigator from their tank, expose them to ordinary atmosphere, and they lose the cognitive state that enables the fold calculation. Maintain a navigator without sufficient spice, and the withdrawal is not merely uncomfortable. It is fatal, because after decades of biochemical integration, the navigator's basic physiological maintenance systems have been rebuilt around the spice compounds. The body no longer knows how to maintain itself without them. At the same time, the navigator cannot survive without navigating. This is not merely a contractual obligation, though it is certainly that. It is biological. The neurological architecture that the melange has built requires the exercise of the fold calculation the way an ordinary human body requires physical activity. A navigator denied navigation work over extended periods experiences a form of cognitive and neurological deterioration that the Guild's own physicians can monitor but cannot reverse. The navigator must navigate. To navigate requires spice. To have spice requires the Guild to control Arrakis. The circle closes on itself completely. Chapter 5. The logistics of a galactic monopoly. There is a distinction that is easy to miss when describing the Spacing Guild's position in the Imperium. A distinction between being the best provider of a service and being the only provider of a service. The Guild is not the best at interstellar transport. It is the only interstellar transport. There is no second network. There is no backup system. There is no route that does not pass through Guild hands. This fact, which is so absolute and so complete that most citizens of the Imperium do not even register it as a political reality, is the actual foundation upon which the entire structure of the known universe rests. The Padishah Emperor rules from Kaitain with the power of the Sardaukar, the finest military force humanity has ever produced. The great houses of the Landsraad deliberate in their assembled council and represent the collective political weight of thousands of noble families with their own armies and economies and centuries of accumulated influence. The Bene Gesserit Sisterhood operates its 10,000-year breeding program and its networks of influence with a patience and a precision that makes ordinary political maneuvering look like the fumbling of children, and all of these powers, every last one of them, moves only by Guild permission and at Guild prices. The transit tax is the formal mechanism through which the Guild extracts its share of everything. It applies to every shipment, every passenger, every military deployment, every diplomatic mission that uses Guild transport, which is to say every one of these things without exception. The rate of the transit tax is not public in the way that ordinary commercial freight rates are public because the Guild negotiates differently with different parties, and those negotiations are treated as proprietary commercial information. What is known from the records of House financial archives and from the occasional disclosure that emerges in legal disputes before the Landsraad, is that the transit tax constitutes a significant fraction of the total economic activity of the Imperium. Houses that maintain extensive interstellar trade networks pay the Guild more per year than they pay the Emperor in fief. The Emperor's relationship with the Guild is perhaps the most revealing illustration of what this monopoly actually means in practice. Shaddam Corrino, the fourth Parisha Emperor of the known universe and one of the most powerful individuals in human history, cannot wage a war across interstellar distances without Guild cooperation. This is not a theoretical constraint, it is an operational one. To move the Sardaukar from Salusa Secundus to any distant theater of conflict requires Heighliners. To supply those forces once deployed requires Heighliners. To receive intelligence from far systems, to deploy comb economic pressure across multiple worlds simultaneously, to do anything that requires coordinating action across the light years that separate the inhabited systems of the Imperium, the Emperor needs the Guild to move his pieces. The Guild uses this leverage with a precision that reflects centuries of institutional experience. It does not threaten. It adjusts prices. It indicates that certain routes are temporarily unavailable. It mentions, in the context of routine commercial negotiations, that the complexity of a proposed military deployment would require routing assessments that might extend over a considerable period. The Emperor understands these communications perfectly, and he responds to them as he would respond to a sufficiently powerful great house, with negotiation, with concession, and with the quiet fury of a man who knows he cannot simply remove the constraint. This creates the three-way balance of power that defines the Imperium's structural politics with a clarity that is almost geometric. The Emperor holds military supremacy through the Sardaukar. The great houses hold collective political weight through the Landsraad and the threat of unified opposition that even the Emperor cannot ignore. The Guild holds logistical supremacy through its transport monopoly. Any two of these three can constrain the third if they act in coordination. None of the three can safely destroy either of the others, because the destruction of any one would collapse the system that all three require to function. The Emperor without the Guild cannot project military power. The Guild without the Emperor loses the political stability that allows commerce to function. The great houses without either become isolated fiefdoms, unable to sustain the economic complexity their populations require. What gives this balance its particular tension, what makes it not merely an elegant political equilibrium, but a genuinely precarious and frightening arrangement, is the nature of the Guild's foundational dependency. The Guild's power rests entirely on its navigators. Its navigators require melange. Melange comes from Arrakis, and only from Arrakis. The known universe has, at the time of the events described in Frank Herbert's original novel, been dependent on Arrakeen spice for somewhere in the range of 10,000 years. In all that time, no one has succeeded in synthesizing melange artificially. The Bene Tleilax, with their mastery of biological engineering, have attempted it. Choam, with its vast resources and its financial interest in any substitute, has funded research programs. The Bene Gesserit, who understand better than almost anyone what is at stake, have applied their considerable scientific intelligence to the problem. No substitute exists. No partial substitute has been found. The spice's molecular complexity, emerging from the extraordinary biology of the sandworm and the specific ecological conditions of Arrakis, has resisted every attempt at replication. The ecological vulnerability of Arrakis is therefore not merely a problem for the people who live there, though it is certainly that. It is an existential threat to every inhabited world in the human universe. The sandworms that produce the spice require a very specific set of conditions that exist on Arrakis, and so far as anyone has been able to determine, nowhere else. They require the deep sand formations. They require the absence of significant surface water, because the worms have a reaction to water that is catastrophic for them. They require the absence of the dense human terraforming activity that would, over time, fundamentally alter the ecology that produces them. Arrakis supports human civilization at the cost of remaining, in all its essential character, hostile to human habitation. If Arrakis were to undergo an ecological catastrophe, if the sandworm population collapsed for any reason, if a planetary event or a deliberate act of sabotage or an ambitious terraforming project succeeded in fundamentally altering the planet's ecology, the spice production would end. The existing stockpiles of melange, distributed across the noble houses and the Guild and the Bene Gesserit and the private collections of thousands of wealthy individuals, would last for a finite period before they were exhausted. During that period, Navigator candidates already in advanced transformation could continue to function. New navigators could not be developed. Existing navigators, as their supplies diminished, would lose the cognitive state that enables navigation, and then the folds would stop. Consider what that actually means in practice. Consider a civilization of 10,000 inhabited worlds, each of which has, over the centuries of Heightliner transit availability, developed economic and social structures predicated on interstellar trade. Worlds that produce food for export to industrial worlds. Industrial worlds that produce manufactured goods for agricultural worlds. Medical centers that serve populations across multiple systems. Educational institutions attended by students from dozens of worlds. Military alliances that depend on rapid mutual reinforcement. Family connections spanning generations of interstellar movement. All of this, every single thread of it, requires fold space transit. Without navigators, the inhabited systems of humanity become isolated points of light with no connection between them. The isolation would not be temporary. It would be permanent, or at least as permanent as the absence of a technology becomes when the infrastructure required to rebuild it no longer exists. In the weeks and months after the last fold, the consequences would begin compounding. Supply chains would fail, worlds dependent on imported food would face starvation within a single growing season. Worlds dependent on imported energy technology would face power shortages within years. Medical supplies would be exhausted with no resupply. The institutional knowledge required to rebuild interstellar civilization, distributed across thousands of worlds with no way to consolidate or share it, would fragment and degrade over generations until it was effectively lost. The Imperium, that magnificent and terrible structure of 10,000 years of human political development, would not survive the end of the spice with its coherence intact. What would survive would be thousands of isolated planetary civilizations, varying wildly in their technological self-sufficiency, cut off from one another by distances that made communication with conventional light-speed signals a generational project and physical travel an expedition lasting centuries. Frank Herbert built this into the structure of his universe with full intention. He was writing about dependence and about the hubris of civilizations that build their survival on narrow foundations. The spice is not merely a plot device. It is an argument. The argument is that any civilization that concentrates a critical dependency into a single point of failure has not solved the problem of survival. It has deferred it with interest. We do not need to look only to fiction to recognize this pattern. The modern world runs on dependencies that are, in their own way, as narrow and as fragile as the Guild's dependency on Arrakeen spice. The concentration of semiconductor manufacturing in a handful of facilities, the dependence of global agricultural productivity on a small number of highly productive grain varieties, the routing of the majority of global internet traffic through specific physical choke points, the reliance of financial systems on specific software architectures that no living person fully understands. These are not analogies to the spice dependency. They are examples of the same structural choice made not by science fiction emperors, but by real institutions and real governments acting in real historical time. Herbert's genius was to make the fragility beautiful and to make the beauty terrifying. The Heightliner folding space is one of the most extraordinary images in all of science fiction. The vast vessel, the mutated god at its heart, the impossible mathematics resolving into safe passage, the entire human galaxy moving along channels that run through the body of a single drug-saturated being floating in an orange mist. It is astonishing, and it is horrifying in equal measure. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps civilizations always look from the inside, like astonishing achievements. Perhaps it takes a certain distance, the distance of a fictional 10,000 years, or the distance of honest historical reflection to see the thread clearly for what it is. A single point upon which everything depends, and the question that always follows, the one that Herbert leaves hanging in the air above every world in his universe, is simply this: what happens when the thread breaks?